Quote, during psychoanalysis, the psychic contact between analyst and analysand is so intimate, and the psychic processes which unfold themselves in that situation are so manifold, that the analytic situation may well include all the conditions that facilitate the occurrence of occult phenomena. These effects are probably connected with transference and seem to indicate the existence of an essential relationship between analytic intuition and the telepathic process. That was stated in 1926 by Helena Deutsch, one of the early pioneers of psychoanalysis, in her paper called Occult Processes Occurring During Psychoanalysis. The telepathic process, that strange world full of charlatans and corner store clairvoyants. Does that really exist in relation to the exquisite shared intersubjective space that can occur between analyst and patient? Can it really occur absent the hard fought for emotional vulnerability that can take years to unfold? And even if so, so what? Would it necessarily facilitate the healing analytic process? How would it deepen one's self-awareness, allowing greater openness to new possibilities for growth? As we will learn today, unconscious communication, or telepathy, has a long, contentious, and indeed secreted history in the development of psychoanalysis. Secreted because many, though not all, of the early analytic pioneers lived in fear that the entire analytic enterprise could be associated with and dismissed along with other circus acts that parade themselves as mind readers. In fact, Freud, like Houdini, spent some time investigating such performers and either uncovered their trickery or alternatively reformulated their so-called discoveries as examples of familiar unconscious conflicts. One reason analysts have a long history of cynicism concerning such seemingly magical, if not infantile, powers is that we so regularly find that supposed thought transmission can be better understood as reflecting the manifestations of intrapsychic repression. Nevertheless, there was a wing of early analysts who would not entirely walk away from the subject. Quote, thought transference is where a verbal message gets transformed into a wave or ray of quite unknown nature, and then on reception is reconverted into material terms. That was Freud, quoted by his biographer and colleague Jones. Further, in 1921, Freud wrote in a letter, quote, if I had to live my life over again, I should devote myself to psychical research rather than psychoanalysis. Now, just to demonstrate how conflicted he was on the subject, he later forgot that he wrote this letter and denied its existence, though in fact the letter was found 8 years later. I was struck by the tolerance for uncertainty concerning these matters that was shared both by Freud and Einstein, who characterized thought transference as, quote, spooky action at a distance. These many years later, we now find ourselves in a psychotherapy world where interrelational concepts are taken for granted. Terms like shared intersubjective space, unconscious attunement, the metabolizer of projective identifications, empathic contact, the analytic third, these are the underpinnings today of our everyday work. Do these represent our tolerance for greater clinical intimacy, perhaps associated with stricter limits on physical interactions? Are these concepts related to the new neurobiological findings of brainwave synchronization between speaker and listener? Are we more deeply approaching, in a different language, what Helena Deutsch called, quote, an essential relationship between psychoanalytic intuition and the telepathic process? A few months ago, my wife and I went to Africa on safari. And in preparation for the trip, as is our inclination, we read up on the various topics of the places we go visit. And one of the things that caught my eye in anticipation of the trip was I learned about the relationship between the acacia tree and giraffes. Now, acacia tree is the favorite food of giraffes. And over the millennia, they've been sort of battling with each other for survival. And ages ago, they were both much shorter than they are now, so the acacia tree developed a strategy to defend itself against the giraffes who would otherwise consume them all. they decided to grow taller, which, as you might imagine, didn't work out so well for the acacia tree. So then what they did is they grew thorns. The thorns surrounded all the leaves, but then the giraffes developed these long tongues that were very leathery and were protected from the thorns. So what's the acacia tree to do? Well, it figured something out. It learned that when a giraffe starts eating the leaves of the acacia tree, the tree is alerted to that and starts secreting tannins into the leaves. Tannins are the bitter things in tea and wine. And that would dissuade the giraffes from eating more of the leaves because it was bitter, and it also interfered with the digestion. So there was a balancing act between how quickly they would secrete the tannins and how quickly the giraffes were able to eat the leaves. This was all discovered by bench researchers who undertook the study of the chemistry of the leaves. But what the field workers learned when you actually go into the field is that when a giraffe starts eating the leaves from tree A, tree B, 20 yards away, also starts secreting tannin into its leaves. And the roots are not connected. The question being, what's the nature of the communication? Well, what the field workers discovered is that on the acacia tree is a special species of ants. They're actually called acacia ants. And they pick up when the acacia tree is the leaves are being eaten, and they have, believe it or not, little tails. And the tails secrete something that is carried by the wind to the ants on the neighboring acacia trees, which basically says, watch out, the giraffes are coming. And they secrete something through their legs, which go onto the leaves, which tell the tree, start secreting tannin because trouble's ahead. That's communication on a literal level. Let's move it up a level of abstraction. Years ago, when I started doing clinical work, I observed this, what I thought was a strange phenomena, where I would have thoughts go through my mind, and soon thereafter, patients would be saying things very similar to what I was just thinking of. Thought it was very strange. As an example, last week, all of a sudden, I was sitting with a patient, and this image of a young woman I know who's very eagerly looking for a job came to mind, just out of nowhere. And 2 minutes later, the patient started talking about this person who really eagerly came to them for a job, and she was feeling badly that she didn't respond to them as promptly as she might. Now, in terms of her psychology, that she projects her own needs onto other people and disavows it in the process is something we're very familiar with. That is, it's the other person who needed the job, and she was going to either respond to it or not. That's how she represents, for the moment, her own needs. That's fine. That's fine. But what to make of the fact that the image was identical, almost word for what had occurred in my mind a few moments before? So when I first started encountering these things when I was younger than I am now, I was confused by it. I couldn't figure out if I was special or weird. And I cautiously then went to senior colleagues and related stories like I just did. And I said, so does this happen to you? And they said, oh, so casually, oh yeah, sure. I said, really? How do you understand this? How does this happen? They said, well, you know, we quote Freud when we get uncomfortable. And we said, well, you know what Freud said? Freud said that's one unconscious relating to another unconscious without going through consciousness. I said, yeah, no, I know the quote. But what does that mean? And they got more and more uncomfortable, and they sort of changed the subject, and we went talking about something else. But of course, if this kind of communication can happen, as it seemingly can, might it also go the other way? My ability to tune into my patient's unconscious, well, why don't patients therefore have the ability to tune into my unconscious? And indeed, there are a few courageous writers who write about such things, and we're going to hear more about that later today. But let's push it up another level of abstraction. This ability that we have to read other people that were involved in intimate relationships and to have our unconsciouses read their unconscious. It didn't start with Freud's notion of the unconscious. If it's in us, as it seems to be, it's been in us since the beginning of historical time. Well, they didn't call it telepathy 1,000 years ago, or unconscious communication 500 years ago. What did they call it? Well, perhaps, just perhaps, this is what has been, and for some still is called, the divine. Maybe that's how this phenomena has been understood throughout history. And maybe that's why the notion that many people have that there is God within us relates to this capacity inside us. And maybe the overlap of these domains explains the fact that years ago, prior generations more so of psychotherapists and analysts, if you ask them their thoughts about religion, what they will answer with solemnity, they will say, psychoanalysis is my religion. Now, I mentioned, going back to our akacia tree, that it really took people from two schools, from the basic science researchers and the field researchers together, to work together to discern the nature of this communication. Because the skill sets are very different. Rarely do you find somebody who has the skill sets of being an academic researcher and also an in-the-field researcher. But today, we have such a person. I had the pleasure of meeting, as it were, Professor Marsha Hewitt when I first read this book. It's called Freud on Religion. Now, there is a substantial literature on Freud, psychoanalysis, religion, psychology, and there are few books that capture what Professor Hewitt captured in here, and that's because of these two skill sets she brings to the task. She is a remarkable academic, and I will go and explain that more in a moment, and also a very sensitive, tuned-in clinician, and this work reflects both skill sets in one person. So, how does one know that one is in the presence of an outstanding academic? And then how do you know you're in the presence of an outstanding clinician? Two different questions. The academic one I find a little easier. For example, in this case, Professor Hewitt is a professor at the Faculty of Divinity at Trinity College, the University of Toronto. She teaches many courses on the undergraduate and graduate level, just a sampling, and I'm only giving you a sampling, of the graduate level courses, many of which she designed herself, called Critical Theory and Feminist Religious Thought, Radical Evil, Philosophy, Religion, and Psychoanalysis, Critical Theory, Religion, and Psychoanalysis, Enemies of God, Modernity, Postmodernity, and the Future of Religion, Religion and Trauma. Just a sampling of the courses she teaches, not to mention the undergraduate courses. And of course, she writes. She wrote this book. She wrote a book, Critical Theory of Religion, a Feminist Analysis. She's written on Juan Luis Segundo and the Theology of Liberation. And she's working on a book related to the topic of tonight called Legacies of the Occult, Unconscious Communication at the Interface of Religion and Psychoanalysis. Again, a sampling of the articles and refereed articles and chapters, just a few. Psychoanalysis, Religious Experience and the Study of Religion. Education for a Global Theology. Women, Nature, and Power. Do women really need a God to save them? A critical inquiry into the notions of the divine feminine. Ideology, Critique, Feminism, and the Study of Religion. Religion, Attachment Theory, and the Limits of Reason. Affective, Cognitive Dimensions, and Cognitive Dimensions of Religious Experience. And a favorite of mine, that we'll return to in a moment, To Never Wholly Die, To Never Fully Live, Death and Rebirth in the Emergence of Self in the Therapeutic Process. That was in the Psychoanalytic Review. There's many more I could mention. Some that again struck out for me is Thinking Through Therapeutic Failure with a Suicidal Patient. You almost never read papers about therapeutic failures. Spirits in the Mind, Gods in the Brain, Contemporary Psychologies of Religious Experience. Other topics she's written on, Emma Goldman, Surrogate Motherhood, Liberation Theology, and Religion and Violence. And needless to say, she lectures around the world. That, for me, is how one knows that someone is an outstanding academician. So how do you know that someone's an outstanding clinician? It's a challenge we in the field face regularly when we're asked for referrals for friends, relatives, colleagues. How do you know? Well, I can answer for myself and for many of my colleagues. First thing is to know something about the person themselves, their character. What kind of person are they? Are they thoughtful? Are they dedicated? Are they really committed to the work? And then the other way you can tell is you listen to the way people talk about their patients. And there are some who talk about their patients and reveal in so doing the full depth of the respect that they have for people who are so vulnerable and who come to us to put their lives in our hands. And some people get that. I've had the pleasure of spending the past couple of days with Marsha, and without any question, she meets those two set of criteria, but there's more. Every so often, you read something that reveals something special about the person's ability to understand what our work is as clinicians. And I'd like to close with a quote from that paper of mine, paper of yours, I wish it was mine, that you wrote that I like so much. To never wholly die, to never fully live, death and rebirth in the emergence of self in the therapeutic process. Quote, the love and faith of the analyst in his patient evokes the possibility for the latter of new relationships of mutual recognition and respect, often for the first time in the patient's life. As the patient comes to value and love himself in being loved and recognized in the analytic relationship, he may develop the capacity to insist that he is entitled to a better life, that the conditions that produce and sustain damage done to individuals are intolerable and must be changed. Such thoughts are only possible in a self that is not dominated by the demands of agendas of others. In evoking the patient's capacity for moral responsibility and for becoming a subject who can say no to the forces of conformity and compliance, we may agree with Jonathan Lear in his introduction to Lowell's papers that psychoanalysis be considered as a secular form of redemption. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Marsha Hewitt.
Thank you very much, and for that wonderfully generous introduction, Harvey. I wasn't quite sure who you were talking about there for a while. It's very hard on Canadians to be praised so much. So thank you. And thank you for the invitation. And thank you and Jan for your wonderful hospitality and generosity yesterday, and for some of the people that I've already met who are here tonight. So thank you. It's really lovely to be here. The paper I'm going to mostly read is basically 3 parts. So the first part is going to be a clinical vignette, something that happened between me and a patient some years ago. The second part is going to be a kind of a psychoanalytic way of thinking about this very strange thing that happened between us. And the third part is going to look at some contemporary treatments of this kind of phenomena that bring the whole issue of psychoanalysis and religion very much into connection. So the first part of the paper I call Telepathic Presencing in the Analytic Relationship. One Monday morning, Kate, whom I had been treating for several years in a 4 times weekly analysis, recounted her dream over the previous weekend. You were in a large house, like a 30s-style mansion, or maybe it was a hotel, and it was on the beach by an ocean, I think. The house had several large rooms, and you were always with large groups of people, talking to them, drinking something or listening to others. It was a really beautiful place, this huge mansion-type house on a beach at the edge of a large sea or ocean. I think maybe it had a pool as well, I can't remember. You seem to be having a good time. On the weekend in question, I had attended a conference at a beautiful Art Deco-style hotel in Santa Monica. It had an outdoor pool that overlooked the beach and the ocean beyond. This particular conference had no concurrent panels and was organized around consecutive plenary sessions. This meant that I was always with large groups of people in the hotel ballroom where the speakers presented. In the breaks between papers, the conference participants gathered, I among them, for coffee and conversation. It was a stimulating conference and a very pleasant weekend. At no time prior to the weekend had I told Kate anything of my whereabouts or even that I would be out of town. It was highly unlikely that she could have any knowledge about the conference or that I planned to attend it. No sessions had been missed to accommodate my trip, no times rearranged. As Kate described her dream, I felt a strange emotional and physical shock of uncanniness. My patient had dreamed my weekend. What was going on here? In the early years of our analytic work, Kate was invariably anxious around breaks, particularly those involving missed sessions. She said she was frightened that she would never see me again. I knew how difficult it was for Kate to hold me in her mind during these absences or feel an ongoing internal connection with me. For her, out of sight meant literally out of mind. Consciously, she worried something bad might happen to me. Unconsciously, she was terrified that I would forget her. At this stage of the analysis, Kate's internal sense of her own continuity of being was bound up with her sense of my capacity to hold her in my mind. In order to help her to sustain this sense of felt existential continuity, both within herself and with me, I sometimes gave her a small object from my office to hold while I was gone. This helped her to hold onto our relationship, which was critical to her holding onto her experience of self. Although not giving her specific details of my whereabouts, usually, I would give her a phone number where I could be reached if necessary. These symbolic linking gestures helped her contain her anxiety around planned separations. Although Kate never once called me during these scheduled breaks, she was comforted to know that she could. On one occasion, shortly before my usual summer vacation, Kate asked to borrow my pen to write down her thoughts during the session times we would be missing. I understood that it was my pen she needed. No other pen would do. In this creative and playful way, she reversed and combined our roles and conjured my presence. One prior occasion, I stepped out of my office briefly as she entered, and when I returned, she was sitting in my chair with an impish grin on her face. In the split second it took me to locate her, I exclaimed, "There you are," with the same feigned surprise that a mother would make upon discovering her child in a game of hide and seek. We both burst out laughing, and she returned to her chair. For quite some time, Kate needed a concrete object of mine to help her through longer breaks in the analysis. As such negotiated arrangements were made only for these periods of separation and not for typical weekend breaks, I saw no need to mention being out of town over the weekend in question. As far as Kate knew, this would be a weekend break like any other. However, the dumbfounding precision of her uncannily accurate dream showed she knew much more. From a psychoanalytic perspective, Kate's dream dramatically revealed that important therapeutic progress had been quietly taking place between us. She had been developing an increasingly robust capacity to remain mentally connected to me during periods of physical separation. It was also an eerie and unsettling demonstration of her capacity to find me if her need was powerful enough. Dreams such as Kate's are neither new nor particularly rare in the psychoanalytic literature, which as of yet remains unsure how to account for them. Freud describes such dreams as telepathic, a term which continues to generate discomfort and confusion within psychoanalysis. Nonetheless, these kinds of dreams do occur, and they challenge us at the very least to question and transform our usual presuppositions about the nature and potentialities of human consciousness, along with the permeability of psychic boundaries. It is increasingly acknowledged within psychoanalysis that telepathic, quote-unquote, dreams are most commonly associated with trauma-based pathologies. Kate's dream was a powerful psychic remnant of a traumatic past, generally characterized by sustained dread of abandonment, which was reignited by her unconscious knowledge not only of my impending absence, but of an emotional, unconscious, psychological absence in me, perhaps due to my excited anticipation and preoccupation about the trip. I think. This is what I think. As I thought back on our sessions in the weeks immediately prior to my departure, I can only conclude that I must have been unconsciously communicating that there was more going on in my mind than being with Kate. This may well have aroused her pain of growing up in a family that barely registered her existence. Memory of her traumatic past was displaced and suspended as she began to relive aspects of it in the consulting room. The sense of safety and predictability Kate usually felt with me was interrupted by the stirrings of childhood terrors, her father's frequent physical abuse, and her dissociated mother's emotional abandonment. Her painfully acquired, finely honed hypervigilance that helped her survive a violent and traumatic childhood became sharply focused on my less than full engagement with her. On the level of conscious shared awareness, nothing had changed between us. But as Kate's unconscious caught what Freud called the drift of my unconscious California dreaming that hovered in the background of our sessions, I believe that she became frightened of losing me. In this re-traumatized state, she found a way to unconsciously communicate both her distress and her newly acquired capacity to stay connected with me. Unlike her dissociated and emotionally unavailable mother, I got the message. In the weeks preceding my trip, I believe now, that Kate was in the grip of what analyst Michael Ballant in 1955 described as a state of intense positive dependent transference. From Ballant's perspective, this kind of telepathic dream is a desperate means of communication whereby a patient struggles to regain the analyst's full attention. In her dream, Kate managed to stay connected with me across a vast geographical distance, Toronto to California. By joining me in her dream, Kate also demonstrated her newly acquired capacity to regulate the painful anxiety of separation, not only by creating me in her mind, but by finding me in mine. Kate's dream poignantly and powerfully communicated her feelings of being marginalized and displaced, even ever so slightly. Vitally important psychic changes had been taking place both within Kate and between us that remained outside our awareness, in part due to what I can only conclude was my unconscious, preoccupied mental state. Now, you should know I did not have travel brochures lying around my office. I did not take phone calls from my travel agent when she was there. So I thought I was very, focused. Kate found an elegant and, for me at the time, very unsettling, telepathic, I say the word, there's quotes around it always, way to communicate this as yet unformulated awareness through her newly acquired capacity to dream her way into my world. Whether her dream was a product of clairvoyant power on Kate's part or any other form of superhuman phenomenon is impossible to establish and beyond the scope of psychoanalytic knowledge. My focus here is on the clinically important question of how to think psychoanalytically about Kate's dream. The astounding accuracy of detail in the dream, while not insignificant, must for now remain a mystery. Again, I follow Balant's view that in order to study parapsychological phenomena profitably, we should not concentrate on either the subject's receptive powers or the healer's or agent's influencing powers, but rather on the powers inherent in their mutual relation. For Balant, the putative uncanny experiences increasingly reported by clinicians, and there's a whole whack of them that I mention here, are best approached in this way, psychoanalytically. His view further coincides with Freud's approach, which holds that such experiences, what Elizabeth Mayer calls extraordinary knowing, seem to occur most often in dream or other altered mental states, and almost always in contexts of intense, affectively charged relationships. Considered from Freud's perspective, Kate's unconscious awareness of my emotional state remained unformulated until it could be made available to her, and subsequently then to me in her dream. Kate's dream was precipitated by a different kind of weekend break, involving, as I said, a big distance, now inflected with a temporarily attenuated clinical intimacy that aroused the accumulated trauma of childhood abandonment. This interpretation recalls Freud's view that telepathic messages received in the course of the day may only be dealt with during a dream the following night. The telepathic exchange between Kate and I was facilitated by the anticipation of my impending trip, which she must have felt. Her dream provided her with a way to bridge the multiple layers of distance that were coming between us. Now, contemporary psychoanalysis acknowledges that putative telepathic, and what this means is tele, distance, pathos, feeling, or suffering. That's all it means. That this kind of experience must be included in its study of the complexities of unconscious communication. As Harvey said in his introduction, this stuff happens. We all know it happens. Psychoanalytic theories of the unconscious, the nature of transference, countertransference, projective identification, and dream analysis provide important explanatory resources for this phenomenon. Not total, but resources. Freud's steadfast opposition to supernatural explanations of uncanny human experiences, which for him belonged in the realm of religion and faith, did not prevent him from recognizing and accepting that minds are capable of communicating outside or beyond the conventional modalities of language and physical cues. For Freud, unconscious communication between analyst and patient was a key component of therapeutic action. Metaphorically drawing upon the new teletechnologies of his day, Freud counseled that the analyst must turn his own unconscious like a receptive organ towards the transmitting unconscious of the patient. He must adjust himself to the patient as a telephone receiver is adjusted to the transmitting microphone. In this way, the analyst's receptive unconscious catches the drift of the patient's unconscious via the latter's free associations. The minds of both the analyst and patient meet through powerful, multivalent, and affective communicational avenues that are generated by and envelop them both. Each feels the other. As New York analyst Lou Aaron writes, each gets under the other's skin, each reaches into the other's guts, each is breathed in and absorbed by the other. For Freud, thought transference, which is what he meant by telepathy, thought transference, occurs as an idea emerges from the unconscious as it passes over from primary process to secondary process mentation. Most importantly, the presence of intense relational affects, emotions are central to shared telepathic communicative experience. Like most analysts, I am at a loss to explain the specific details associated with uncanny experiences. I think it's important, though, we learn to hold this uncertainty comfortably and not get defensive about it. While analysts seldom understand how we intuit what we know, the therapeutically important point is to focus on, and this is a quote from Helen Deutsch, as Harvey mentioned her earlier, to focus on what actually occurs without worrying about how it can be explained, like the details of Kate's dream about the hotel I was at. As Deutsch further commented with regard to her own clinical experience of unconscious communication, they confirm that occult powers are to be sought in the depth of psychic life. Now, just a note, the word occult, of course, has been assigned to the trash bin of culture. All it means is hidden. So if I drop this bottle of water on the floor, you know that it's gravity. You can't see gravity, it's occult. If you take an aspirin for a headache, you know the headache goes, but you can't see what the aspirin's doing. It's occult. That's all it means. Just hidden, that's it. Doesn't mean Ouija boards or anything like that. I mean, it can, but it's not the way I'm. Psychoanalysis is inevitably a multidisciplinary enterprise that draws on both the humanities and the sciences, and I agree with this. Unlike some of my colleagues, I think this is important. As psychoanalysis wonders more explicitly about unconscious communication, it opens itself to the dialogue with other disciplines such as religion and more recently quantum physics and neuroscience. I'll say a little bit about that a bit later. Now at this point, it might be helpful to recall Freud's distinction in Moses and monotheism between the historical truth of religious knowledge and subjective experience and the facts of objective or what he called material truth. While Freud did not hesitate to claim that Moses was an Egyptian who was murdered by his own people as an objective material fact, for example, he nonetheless vacillated about whether this ancient crime was based in psychic or factual truth. He goes back and forth with that. I think deliberately, at least I hope so. For him, I think it was a combination of both. In Freud's view, the unconscious contents of our minds must in some way derive from experiences in the external world that become encoded and transformed in representations of fantasy, myth, religion, and art. While a tentative consideration of disciplines, for example, now, such as quantum physics and neuroscience, in dialogue with psychoanalysis, cannot prove the existence of unconscious communication in the usual factual kind of empirically demonstrable way, they can nevertheless offer important metaphorical strategies for thinking about how human beings know what they know about the minds of others, although I am very cautious about that. At the same time, it is important that psychoanalysts not lose sight of its central focus on psychoanalytic interpretations and psychoanalytic meaning that are specific to specific therapeutic relationships. As clinicians, we must not lose sight of the fact, again, this is my view, that therapeutic action takes place within the intense emotional connectedness of the analytic relationship created between the analytic partners who are not as separately distinct as they perceive or may prefer themselves to be. And sometimes weird things really do happen. Now, the second part of my paper, I want to talk about Hans Lowald, because Hans Lowald, for me, provides a very important resource for thinking psychoanalytically about this very weird phenomenon. He was a German philosopher turned psychoanalyst, studied with Heidegger, who he became very disillusioned with, given Heidegger's sort of flirtation with Nazism, as you can well imagine. He emigrated to the US in 1939, and he spent the majority of his career in Connecticut. His theory of interpenetrating psyches I find very interesting, and I just want to say, that I find these interesting. I'm not saying, and I don't want to give the impression that I think this is a final explanation. It's a way of thinking. I'm much more concerned with ways of thinking than I am in finding the truth. So I just want to just say that at the outset. Building on Freud's theory of primary and secondary narcissism, which I'm not going to bother going into now, Lowald reframes the concept of infant-mother connectivity in terms of a shared psychic or love matrix that is generated by them and envelops them both. It's very fashionable now to talk about the third. It's kind of like that, I think. Mother and infant exist together in mutual empathic communication, punctuated by fusion states and a gradually developing awareness of difference. The boundaries between self and other are fluid and permeable in early infancy, he says. This is what he says. This view draws upon Freud's later theory of mind, where ego and superego differentiation emerges or shades out of their common source, the id. I'm not thinking it really structurally, but more in terms of more fluid kind of boundaries between the mental agencies. A reasonably healthy mother is able to open her mind to receive and read that of her infant. In healthy enough environments, the infantile sense of self in and with other constitutes the unconscious source of potential artistic and intellectual creativity, including mystical or spiritual experiences of unity and oneness with the world. So for Lowald, there was a time when we knew this kind of fusion. For Lowald, the unconscious and conscious dimensions of the psyche become capable then of fostering and strengthening interconnected linkages through a developmental process that he calls differentiation. These internal connections, self in other, other in self, are vulnerable to a variety of distortions due to environmental trauma and or neglect, with the result that the individual can experience aspects of his or her mind as terrifyingly alien or other. Whatever possessed me to do that? The devil made me do it. That sort of, I was abducted, these kinds of explanations for real experiences. The feeling of being possessed by spirits, for example, like I said. However, in more optimal environmental conditions, psychic linkages between mental states are established and cultivated. The unconscious provides a resource of vitality and creative energy that enlivens conscious awareness and action. The interpenetrability of mental states within the mind facilitates possibilities for connections between or with other minds. I think Freud had something like this in mind with his observation, very widely quoted. It's a very remarkable thing that the unconscious of one human being can react upon that of another without passing through the conscious. Descriptively speaking, the fact is incontestable. What Freud could not account for, and what remains unaccounted for to this day, is exactly how such interaction occurs. Freud describes the internal state of the neonate as expanding outward, like the body of an amoeba is related to the pseudopodia which puts it out. This movement of libidinal or love or seeking energy encompasses elements of the loved objects or others that then become internalized through identifications that deepen and differentiate the infant's developing mental states. This suggests for Lowald, at least the way he reads Freud, is that in earliest infancy, the sense of self and sense of reality are integrated. So for him, it's not like there's baby confronting mother, mother confronts baby. That, for him, is not the way to think about it. In other words, the infant doesn't confront reality out there as separate, but reality exists in here. And what we call in here and out there is the result of a developmental process of differentiation and integration, what Freud understood as eros. This is what Freud may have had in mind in his meditation on his friend Romain Rolland's description of the oceanic feeling. And the oceanic feeling is that sense of eternity, an indissoluble bond, a oneness with the world, mystical states, what is known as perennial mystical states that people report and have reported forever. Although Freud confesses that personally he never felt it, he cannot accept it as the primary nature of religious experience and belief. For him, that was not the source of religious experience, although he did acknowledge that it happened and people did have these experiences. What he tried to do was to psychoanalytically understand it. Romain Rolland wrote to him, he said, I have this feeling all the time. And Freud said, I don't, but let's see how we can think about that. And he related it to his theory of primary narcissism in early infancy, where the child does not yet distinguish his ego from the external world as the source of the sensations flowing in upon him. The developing child only gradually acquires self-awareness in response to various promptings from the external world. As Lowald observes, this primordial type of experience is not unique to the mother-infant matrix. It, or its direct derivatives, are encountered in various forms of adult experience, such as mystical, religious, spiritual experiences. The words aren't exactly interchangeable, but I'll just put them that way for now. Now, as the child gradually embraces reality, she develops the capacity for differentiation. Self-other, me, not me. For Freud, adult present ego feeling is only a shrunken residue of a much more inclusive, indeed an all-embracing feeling which corresponded to a more intimate bond between the ego and the world around it, he writes. Since these, what we now call merger states, Fred Pine calls them merger states, are part of the neonatal past, they are then to be regarded as real experiences that remain preserved in the mind, like they really did happen, behind and beside subsequent stages of development. Freud speculated that if the mind regresses far enough, traces of this originary experience can once more be brought to light, mediated and filtered through later developmental stages. Lowald situates this originary experience of undifferentiated, oceanic, indissoluble oneness within the earliest infant mother psychic matrix. And I'm using that deliberately. That's his formulation rather than relationship. I think it's a little closer to what he means. In his view, ego development, therefore, is differentiating movement that progresses through increasingly complex stages toward integration, unity, or what he called reconciliation, which is part of the sublimation process. Understood in this way, sublimation is not defensive, it's not a flight from the unconscious, it rather draws on the unconscious and is energized by it. And he wrote quite a bit about that. Sublimation describes the transformation of primary into secondary process mentation, through which, as Freud describes in his study of Leonardo da Vinci, passion is converted into a thirst for knowledge. Freud describes Leonardo's instinct for research as fueled by the divine spark of early affective energies that become transformed or sublimated into intellectual curiosity. It feels good to know. Knowing, learning can be deeply pleasurable. This process is not a progression of psychological stages. It's not one builds on the other. Rather, for Lowald, it includes contradiction, conflict, spiraling, reconciliation, a dissolving of achieved reconciliations, and new resolutions of dissonances that culminate in a higher, individuated psychic unity. Lowell goes on to say that if this process of sublimation is disrupted by defensive, alienating repressions, the connections between the various elements of psychic experience, linking primary and secondary process, may be broken or stunted. Excuse me. The result of psychic alienation is an impaired capacity for symbolization. For Lowell, the mind is initially a formless unity that becomes increasingly differentiated and complex in its ongoing interactions with the world. What is particularly relevant, then, to unconscious communication, I think, is Lowell's idea that there is no primordial individual or self-instinctive core, but rather a wider subjectivity that includes the creative, destructive powers of the parental couple. And I think this is very important. Although Lowell doesn't say this notion of a wider subjectivity could be expanded in the direction of William James's idea of a cosmic psychic reality that becomes instantiated or filtered in particular individual subjectivities. Lowell doesn't say that, but I think his ideas could lend itself to a Jamesian interpretation, which is not Freud, which is fine. The crucial point here, then, is that what are naively called objects plays an essential part in the constitution of the subject, and what is naively called subject plays an essential part in the organization of objects, so that there is no such thing as a discrete, bounded, or separate individual subject in here who encounters an equally discrete and bounded individual object out there. Otherness belongs to both the constitution and self-experience of individual identity. This internally relational subjectivity is always potentially in a state of receptive openness towards other minds and different parts of the self. This concept of mind provides more expansive explanations of clinical phenomena such as transference, countertransference, projective identification, and different forms of unconscious communication, including what we call thought transference or telepathy. I think this is a very helpful and very useful, especially clinical, psychoanalytic way of thinking about this. But it's not, I'm not offering it as, that's the final explanation, because I don't know what's going on any more than anybody else does. But I find this a helpful way of thinking about it. So, psychoanalysis of anomalous experiences, weirdness. These kinds of experiences may at times be shocking in their suddenness, terrifying or blissful. Sometimes they're both. Lowell explains that such experiences are often felt as threats to individuality, to the ego's cohesion and stability, but they may also lead to blissful exaltation. And the history of mystical literature, if you read through mystical literature, it's not always a joyful kind of blissful unity with God. It can be exactly, the opposite. Lowell's relational and differentiated unitary theory of mind, then, can give us a coherent theoretical framework within which to think about anomalous experiences and how we can psychoanalytically formulate them. But for some analysts, this isn't enough. This is very inadequate. And this, I think, in turn, accounts in turn for the embracing of quantum physics. And there are a number of contemporary analysts, Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer was one of them, who really went in that direction. This, of course, goes back to Jung. Jung was a very good friend of Pauli, a very important quantum physicist in the 30s. And so what happens is, and here's where James comes back, I think, some writers interpret these instances of unconscious communication in terms of an implicate order. That's a phrase from David Bohm, which envisions the whole universe as in some way enfolded in everything, and that each thing is enfolded in the whole. ideas of non-locality, spooky action at a distance, and Bell's theorem, where under certain conditions, particles that are at macroscopic orders of distance from each other appear to be able, in some sense, to affect each other, even though there is no known means by which they could be connected. So if you have particles that were once in proximity, and you move them across, the ends of the Earth, you do something to one particle, the other particle reacts as if it's happening to it. This kind of thing becomes very suggestive for some contemporary psychoanalysts, right? So this idea of non-locality is one that has been looked at and been drawn upon to encourage or to inspire some analysts to speculate on how the individual boundaried mind and the radically connected mind describe models of mind that can start to complement each other in new ways. For some analysts, aspects of quantum theory offer alternate models of conceptualizing clinical experience. So this idea of the particles, reacting in the same way, is called entanglement. That's another name for it. And this provides a possible explanation for psychic phenomena, such as described with my patient's dream. Other analysts don't go there. They look rather to neuroscience and the phenomenon of mirror neurons to explain this, or the intuitive powers of right brain functioning. So there are many, and I think what's good about this is that psychoanalysis is drawing on other disciplines. I think that's very important that it does that. But I also think that we have to be very careful, because as psychoanalysts or people interested in psychoanalysis, we're not neuroscientists, and some of us might be, and we're not quantum physicists. And I think we'd be very careful about the statements we make, and the statements especially that we make about what happens in the subatomic world and the macro world. I think we just need to watch it. At the same time, the idea of the deep interconnectedness of the universe, we are stardust, they tell us, and the entangled nature of consciousness may provide rich metaphorical strategies, and I think this is important, rich metaphorical strategies for current psychoanalytic theorizing about connected minds. The same, I think, applies to the study of mirror neurons as contributing to the ways of understanding how minds know each other. But we have to be, I think, very careful about this. Although Freud did not understand how this worked, how unconscious communication worked, he also turned to the science of his day. The newly developed telecommunication technologies that I mentioned earlier, he used them as interpretive strategies for thinking about thought transference. He did not at any point rely on spiritual or religious explanations. He drew the line there. There's a lot to say about that I can't go into now, but he was aware of the psychic researchers of the day, and that's something I'll touch on, but we could talk more about later, right? So for him, thought transference has to be accounted for psychoanalytically and neurobiologically. Although, as you know, or some of you know, he did not reduce mind to brain either. He didn't do that. We don't know how the unconscious works. He didn't. We still don't understand it. But I think he would agree with a remark of Barbara Ehrenreich in the New York Times a couple of years ago. If something has happened that you don't have words for, then keep thinking. Now, the last part of my paper, I'm going to talk about a very different kind of approach to this phenomenon, and that's one represented by the late James Grotstein, who you may have heard of. In his book, in 2000, his 2000 book, Who is the Dreamer Who Dreams the Dream?, James Grotstein recasts the mysterious nature of what Freud called the dream's navel in very explicit spiritual, mystical terms. For Grotstein, the navel of the dream, that's the part you get to, you can't explain, you have to stop. The dream's navel is a mystical portal through which the numinous origins of ultimate mystery, these are quotations from it, ultimate mystery or absolute truth or ultimate and infinite reality may be experienced. It is an interface, the dream, between cosmic spirit and its individualized presence that becomes instantiated or filtered through the mind of the dreamer. Grotstein's ultimate and infinite reality draws very heavily on Wilfred Bion, his notion of O, a concept derived from religious and Neoplatonic philosophy. With Grotstein in particular, clinical work is a form of spiritual practice. It is a sacred analytic passion play, he writes, through which the analyst priest absorbs the patient's pain. And he quotes Bion, who says, to use the sign O to denote that which is the ultimate reality represented by terms such as ultimate reality, absolute truth, the Godhead, the infinite, the thing in itself. O can become, but it cannot be known. It is darkness and formlessness. Its presence can be recognized and felt. The religious mystics have probably approximated most closely to expression of experience of it. Its existence is as essential to science as to religion. Now, from a Bionian perspective, psychoanalytic work may reveal glimpses of O, the pre-existing unity that is ultimate reality. O, whose existence is conjectured phenomenologically, is the origin or the one, the generator of forms, or what Bion terms preconceptions. As knowledge precedes experience, individual learning is a process of recollection of an original oneness that was split and fragmented in the catastrophic divisions of birth and later life traumas. The infant remembers the perfection and infinity of its fetaldom when it shared its oneness with the essences of the eternal forms of Plato, Grotstein writes. He interprets the numinous experience as sacrifice as underlying many patients' dreams and recollections of intrauterine experience with their first playmate, the placenta, whose death is required to initiate the act of birth. Grotstein appears to agree with Freud fleetingly that dreams are products of the unconscious, where elements of knowledge that remain outside of conscious awareness during the day may appear in the nocturnal dream. In this sense, dreams are forms of communication of the mind with itself, and on occasion include forms of communication with other minds. While Freud accepted that dreams could provide access to communications picked up from other minds, he did not accept the existence of telepathic dreams in any occult sense. He was adamant that such dreams are to be treated psychoanalytically. But in Grotstein's view, the unconscious capacity for prescience and premonition found in dreams suggests that one aspect of the self seems to be superior in knowledge to our more ordinary self because of the mystical, preternatural, or numinous nature of the unconscious. Grotstein rejected what he described as Freud's scientific and mechanistic approach that drains the unconscious of its inherent mystery and obliterates its true mystical power. Grotstein revisions Freud's idea of the id, the it, as like a god within the sacred architecture of the psyche. Here Grotstein interprets Bion's O as cosmic consciousness that both congeals in and flows through individual minds. So we dream, but the universe dreams us. This mystical reality can be occasionally glimpsed in dreams. Dreams function as a contact barrier that organize, protect, and mediate the impingements of this sort of mystical O, which may be chaotic and dangerously overwhelming to the dreamer. Dreaming acts as a filter for unmentalized infinite emotional truth or sensory overload of O. Dreaming perceives, anticipates, and formats oncoming premonitory experiences. Dreams are memoirs of the future, a listening in on the secret conversations of the gods. The dreamer who dreams the dream is the elusive, ineffable subject within us who lurks on the other side of Freud's dream navel. Now, there has been a long-standing assumption in the history of psychoanalysis in some quarters that Freud's theories contain hidden mystical dimensions, kind of like this, that resonate strongly with esoteric traditions such as Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Grotstein in some ways shares this view, while also pointing out Freud's own religion, which was science, or logical positivism, he says. Nonetheless, Grotstein wants to argue, and he's not alone in this, that a latent, hidden religiosity lies within Freud's concept of the unconscious, which can be understood as the closest to the idea of God that man can possibly contemplate, and that he has contemplated this deity as a heavenly projective identification. Grotstein strongly suggests that Freud's excessive focus on science blinded him to the mystical nature of the unconscious. Freud, however, did not agree with this view of the unconscious, because for Freud, his theories in his own mind were not compatible with religious interpretations. He said, "I think I'm farthest from being a mystic." Freud's notion of the unconscious is very different than Grotstein's description of the unconscious as a mystical second self. So how do we deal with this kind of maybe difference in psychoanalysis? I think it comes down to these different understandings of the unconscious. And where do we then locate a writer like Grotstein, who's a very influential and very important and well-respected thinker, and his own analyst, Wilfred Bion, even more so. It's not Freud who stands behind this. It's William James, and it's the psychical researcher Frederick Myers. And this is not acknowledged in psychoanalysis. It may not be known, or maybe it's part of the unconscious of psychoanalysis. Just a word on Frederick Myers. Frederick Myers was an English person, a Cambridge classicist, and a kind of a psychologist who introduced Freud and Breuer's work on hysteria to the English-speaking world. Myers agreed with Freud and psychoanalysis that consciousness does not represent the major portion of mental life. But here's a big difference. Myers postulated that the powerful and creative psychic forces hidden beneath the threshold of consciousness were a source of supernormal, not supernatural, supernormal psychic capacities whose existence are manifested in dreams, hallucinations, dissociated states, clairvoyance, telepathy, and authentic mediumistic capacities for communication with spirits of the dead. The cornerstone of Myers' psychology, Myers dies in 1901, and he was a big influence on Carl Jung. The cornerstone of Myers' psychology was his belief in the survival of the human personality after bodily death. Myers argued that the individual subconscious, which is not the unconscious in Freud, it's a subconscious or subliminal self, originates in a universal cosmic mind within which the individual mind is reabsorbed after death. It's important to bear in mind that Myers' theory of a subliminal self is much closer to Freud's idea of the preconscious than the unconscious. His was a mystical psychology that conceived of a subliminal consciousness that contained supernormal potentials that are revealed in these hypnotic states and communication with the spirit world. And one of the things that he did in the Society for Psychical Research that he helped found in 1882 was to investigate mediumistic phenomena, for example, to sort out who were the genuine mediums from the charlatans. Because they were convinced that these mediums were people who had some kind of special sensitivity, some kind of permeable subjectivity that let them be open to this larger cosmic reality, and that you could communicate with them in altered states. His close friend, his very close friend and colleague, William James, the American, they believed that this subliminal self is the fountainhead of much that feeds our religion. The sacred is a structure of mind. This is very, very close. And it's interesting when you read someone like Rothstein because he never mentions these people. And he may not have read them at all. But it's very interesting, the power of these ideas and how they have entered and remain active in psychoanalysis today. For Myers, telepathy in particular provided powerful evidence for the existence of supernormal mental powers that resonate with later quantum theories of non-locality or entanglement. This is how it's seen. I'm not saying this is how it is with quantum theory, but this is how it's seen. Some contemporary analysts find powerful support in this aspect of quantum theory for their ideas of irreducible minds. Like their 19th century precursors, analytic writers such as Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer extend psychoanalysis into the field of parapsychology in their efforts to explain a wide range of psychic phenomena such as crisis apparitions, remote viewing, precognition, divination, that sort of thing. Myers's psychological theories were an integral part of his work in psychical research. The notion of a subatomic connectedness of all reality could be seen as compatible with Myers's theory of a unitary self that is congealed, filtered, and refracted into an infinity of temporal pinpoints of individual consciousness that exist within a timeless cosmic mind. A contemporary analytic thinker, Gargiulo, if I'm pronouncing his name right, would see the idea of the collapse of the wave function in this way. This is how he would use that as a metaphor for this kind of thing that I just described. So although almost entirely unacknowledged, it's Myers, not Freud, who stands behind emerging trends within contemporary psychoanalysis as a mystical science. The shift from a Freudian unconscious to a Myersian subconscious allows spiritually oriented analysts such as Rothstein to declare that psychoanalysis, this is a quote, psychoanalysis is more mystical, spiritual, and religious than its followers realize. And religion, especially spirituality, is more psychoanalytic than its followers realize. As one sympathetic commentator observes, Rothstein has written the Gnostic gospel of depth psychology. The intersection of Grotstein's Gnostic psychoanalytic vision represents a contemporary, thoroughly modern psychoanalysis resurrected and refashioned out of its 19th century roots in the modern occult psychology of Frederick Myers and the Society for Psychical Research. If we regard Freud's theory of the unconscious as a branch on the evolutionary tree of modern psychology, it may not survive the growing developments and influence of a visionary psychoanalysis whose goal is to lead the individual on an inward path to the gnosis, secret knowledge of his or her own sacred psychic architecture. And I think from this perspective, it is fair to say that Freud may become the discarded other of psychoanalysis. Thank you for your patience.